So, First Minister, a poll out today shows that support for Scotland staying in the UK is at its strongest for 2.5 years. Do you feel as if this is the biggest gamble that you've ever taken?
It's a big decision, there's no doubt about it, but it's one that I've taken in what I consider to be the best interests of Scotland. It's all about giving people in Scotland a choice. If we don't have the option of a referendum, then effectively we are accepting right now a future that is a hard Brexit future with Conservative governments at Westminster for perhaps 20 years or more. Now, if people want that, then that's fine, they can choose that, but I think it's right that people have a choice given how much is now at stake for our country.
So let's be absolutely clear, is a vote for independence a vote to stay in the European Union then or not?
I want Scotland to stay in the European Union. That's long-standing SNP policy. What we have to do, as we did in 2014, but now in the different circumstances we face, is before people are asked to make that choice, set out the process by which we secure our relationship with Europe. But
I notice you say a relationship with Europe. I mean, that could be a slightly looser arrangement like, for example, Norway has with the European Economic Area. Is that right?
No, I've said I want Scotland to be in the European Union. I campaign for Remain. That is why I think that's the best future.
But so that is what people are voting for?
Well, what I also think is that we are now at a crossroads as a country where our relationship with Europe is important, and we are in this position because of the Brexit vote where the UK voted to leave but Scotland voted to remain. But the decision that lies ahead for us is actually a much bigger one, and I would argue more fundamental than just our relationship with the European Union. It is really a decision about the kind of country we're going to be, and the stakes are high. We know that if we go down the path that Theresa May and the Conservative government want us to go down, then that's not just out of the EU, it's out of the single market, it's perhaps consigning ourselves to 10, 20 years of Conservative government. We've heard statements from the Prime Minister that she wants to centralise power at Westminster rather than have powers coming back from Europe and going to the Scottish Parliament. So there are big decisions for us. And the fundamental thing here, clearly everybody knows I want Scotland to be an independent country, but what I think is actually more important right now is that the path we take as a country, whatever that turns out to be, is not chosen for us, it's chosen by us. So choice for me is really the fundamental principle at stake.
The red line in that choice, though, is rejoining the single market, perhaps, rather than rejoining the European Union.
Well, I've made clear my views on the European Union, but we've also got to recognise where we are. We're now in a position. In 2014, Scotland was considering becoming independent from a UK that was very firmly a member of the European Union. At that time, ironically, people said if we voted yes, we would compromise our membership of the EU. Now the UK is coming out of the EU, and Scotland has to consider the position we are in now. But I believe, and this is the heart of the compromise I've tried to strike with Theresa May, I believe it's really important that we do continue to trade within the single market as members of the single market, not instead of trade across the UK, which we will always continue to do, but to keep our place in the world's biggest single market. That matters for jobs, it matters for investment in our country, for living standards, and it also says something about the kind of country we want to be. I want Scotland to be an open trading country, one that welcomes people who want to come and make a contribution to our economy, not a country that looks in on itself and tries to pull up the drawbridge.
It's interesting to hear you talking so enthusiastically about the single market as opposed to the European Union as a whole. I just wonder what your message is to the third of SNP voters, roughly, who voted for Brexit. How do you reassure them?
Well, what I would say, and I respect the views of people who voted to leave the European Union. Of course I do. There were 1 million of those in Scotland, although a minority in Scotland, and I think people reached that decision for a variety of reasons. But fundamentally, I suppose I'm saying to people in Scotland across the spectrum of opinion on the issue of Europe is that whatever path we take as a country, surely it should be one decided by us, not for us. Right now, the decisions that are being taken around Brexit, and a hard Brexit, are being taken regardless of the views of people in Scotland. So let's make sure we're in control of the future direction of our country ourselves, rather than having that direction decided by governments at Westminster. That's the point of principle. It's about choice and democratic decision making.
Is there anything that Theresa May could say or do now to make you call off this referendum?
I think that has to be for her to decide. I have really bust a gut over the past few months trying to reach some kind of common ground and compromise with the Prime Minister, to the point that, I guess at periods over the last few months, people on my own side and my own party probably thought that I was maybe trying too hard to reach a compromise rather than just doing what my manifesto gives me a mandate to do, which is say we should have a referendum. So we put forward compromise proposals. I accepted in those proposals that, notwithstanding how Scotland voted in the EU referendum, we would leave the EU, but tried to build some common ground around the single market. Tried to make the argument, which many people across the UK would agree with, that the UK should stay in the single market, but if not, ask the UK government to explore a way that Scotland could do that. And all of those efforts have just been met with this brick wall of intransigence.
But if Theresa May gets some kind of Brexit trade deal that is, in your judgment, pretty much as good as the single market, could you then say, right, I'll call the referendum off?
Well, look, I don't think she's going to, and I'm not alone in that. I think, there is more chance right now of Theresa May getting a bad deal or no deal than there is of getting a deal that is just as good as the single market. And there's a whole variety of reasons that lead me to that conclusion. But what I'm saying is that, and it goes back to this choice argument, I think we're now at a stage where people in Scotland deserve a choice. So at a time when the terms of the Brexit deal are clear, much clearer than they are today, but before it's too late for us to choose a different course, people in Scotland can look at the terms of the Brexit deal and the opportunities of independence and make that choice. And that's why I keep talking about choice. Because if I right now say, I'm going to rule out having a referendum, I'm making that choice for people unilaterally. I'm saying it's hard Brexit come what may. I think that is a choice that should be made by people in Scotland, and setting out that kind of plan for Scotland is better in my judgment than me as First Minister simply letting the country drift through the next 2 years, crossing my fingers, hoping for the best, but fearing actually that it's the worst that we're going to encounter.
When you first met Theresa May after she became Prime Minister last year, you said she was, and I quote, a woman who has a fairly business-like way of doing things, which I have too. So I think we can find a way of working together. She said she was willing to listen to options and that she wouldn't trigger Article 50 until we have a UK approach. Whatever happened to that relationship?
Well, look, I'm not sitting here and saying I'm faultless and all the rest of it. It takes two people to build a relationship, and I'm prepared to accept that I have to work at that relationship too. But I have really tried to build compromise, and I have at every turn been met with an inflexibility, almost a condescension towards Scotland that has made that really impossible to do. Now, the Prime Minister did say that she wouldn't trigger Article 50 until we had a UK-wide approach agreed with not just Scotland, but all of the devolved administrations. But on Monday, when I made the speech I made in Bute House, for all I knew at that point, Article 50 was being triggered the next day. I didn't even know that for sure, but I certainly wasn't aware of any UK-wide agreement. Now, there's one anecdote that I used earlier in the week to illustrate the frustrations I felt here. The day Theresa May made the Lancaster House speech, I spoke to her on the phone a couple of hours or so before she made the speech, and I asked her a direct question. Are you going to rule out UK single market membership? And the answer she gave me was, that's not a binary choice. And yet, a couple of hours later, she stood up in that speech and it had become a binary choice and she ruled it out. Now, that doesn't help to build a partnership or a relationship based on trust and honest discussion that can be the foundation for compromise. And I found that very frustrating, not just personally. It doesn't matter about the personal dynamics here, but as First Minister of Scotland, trying to protect the interests of the country I'm elected to represent, that is deeply frustrating and really gave me no alternative but to say, well, if it's going to be Theresa May or no way, hard Brexit or nothing, then I really have a duty to give people in Scotland a choice of something different.
So you felt betrayed by her?
Oh, look, I'm not going to get into horribly emotive language, but it's very difficult to build compromise with someone who doesn't, I'm not going to personalise it, a government that doesn't want to bring us into the tent. Now, I accept that there will be suspicion on the part of the Conservative government about the motives of the SNP and the Scottish government. I accept that, and that's why I'm saying, I'm not sitting here saying I'm some paragon of virtue in all of this. But in this occasion, I have absolutely tried my hardest to reach agreement, as I said earlier, to the point of no doubt frustrating some people in my own party at times, and have found it impossible to do that. And there's an important point here, even for people who have no sympathy with or aren't bothered about Scotland or the Scottish Government, even the sensible heads in the Conservative Party, I would say this in all seriousness. I think people should be worried about how the Prime Minister has dealt with Scotland as we go into the Article 50 negotiations, because if she treats other European countries with the same inflexibility as she's treated Scotland, then I think this process is headed for the rocks. And therefore, I think it's in everybody's interest that perhaps some lessons are learned about the experience that Scotland's had over the past few months.
Theresa May, of course, says that you're playing games and that politics isn't a game. And obviously one of the issues that you're accused of playing games on is timing. If Westminster grants you the referendum, but with strings attached on when you hold it, do you go ahead, do you comply with that, or do you go ahead and hold it at a time of your own choosing?
Well, let me try and sort of answer that in a couple of different ways, well, making the same point, but from principle and then in a practical sense. On a point of principle, and this principle was really established back in 2014 when the UK government at the time said the rules of a referendum should be made in Scotland. So, if the Scottish Parliament decides it wants to have a referendum, the Scottish Parliament will vote on this next week and decides when that should be. I think it should be for the Scottish Parliament to decide, not the Westminster government. But secondly, and this is more of a practical point, I think it's really important that if we're to have that choice, we have it when the terms of Brexit are clear, but before it's too late to choose a different path if that's what we decide.
But you don't have that choice, do you? I mean, Brussels was saying that if you're hoping that Scotland can somehow stay in the EU before Brexit happens, that's
but what I'm saying
hope.
is, well, as I said earlier on, we will have a duty before asking people to make this choice to set out the process by which we ensure our relationship with Europe. But I think it's common sense that the longer we leave it to tell Europe that we want a different relationship with them to the rest of the UK, the harder it will be to negotiate that. And I think practically for the UK government to be in a position where, having sunk the ship, they're going to puncture Scotland's lifeboats as well would not be acceptable. But the last point I would make is really, I suppose, to point out the contradiction in the Tory position on this. Now, their claim, which is not one I accept incidentally, but their claim is that an independence referendum causes uncertainty. My view would be that uncertainty is there already, it's caused by Brexit. But if that is their fear, that it causes uncertainty, then why on earth would they argue to prolong that uncertainty? Because what I'm arguing is that Scotland should have a choice at the point that the Brexit terms are clear. We take that decision then, make that choice then, and then we get clarity for everybody at that point.
But you have to comply with Westminster's timetable, don't you, legally?
Well, we will now have a discussion, assuming the Scottish Parliament gives me the authority to enter those discussions next week, which I hope it will. But we will then enter a discussion. All I'm doing is setting
with Westminster?
With the UK government, yes. And all I'm doing is setting out some of the principle but also practical reasons why the window that I have set out in terms of a timescale makes sense.
Obviously, it was the Brexit vote that prompted your decision to hold this second referendum. But it's not an ideal time for you in many ways, is it? Because if you look at the economic arguments for independence, oil, for example, I mean, you were banking on oil at $100 a barrel, it's now half that. This isn't great timing for you, is it?
Well, look, I think it's important to take decisions based on what you think is the right thing for the country. Now, Scotland's got a deficit. I'm not going to sit here and deny that reality. The UK's got a massive deficit. Scotland's deficit has been created effectively on Westminster's watch, and when faced with that kind of situation, you've got a choice really. You can decide that we allow Westminster, who's created the economic position we're in, to continue making the same mistakes, or we decide that we're going to use our own skills and resources and aptitudes to build and grow and innovate our way to a stronger and more sustainable economy.
But it also makes mistakes with your own. If you add in the oil barrel deficit, I mean, that's going to add to that deficit.
Most independent countries don't have any oil. That's the point here. Of course, oil is an advantage that Scotland has had, and the benefits of that over generations have flowed to Westminster, rather than the situation we see in Norway that built up the massive oil fund for future generations. But most independent countries the same size as Scotland or smaller than Scotland, don't have any oil. Scotland has got a varied economy. We've got one of the most educated populations in the world. And my point is, for any country, not just for Scotland, if you're faced with a difficult situation, you can keep doing the same things that got you into that difficult situation, and you find probably that you don't make it better. Or you can say, look, there's a better way of running this country, of governing this country, of building a better society and a stronger economy.
You've been making a lot of the news this week on this second referendum. Some news from Westminster this morning, a U-turn on national insurance increases. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'm glad they've dropped the policy to increase national insurance contributions on self-employed people. That seems to me to be, putting a tax increase on, people who are using their initiative and getting out there and trying to make their own lives better. But it does say something, does it not, about the chaos that appears to be reigning at the heart of the Westminster government. How you can get into a position where the Chancellor stands up in the budget one week and announces this as confidently and as firmly as he did, and then literally a week later has decided it's a breach of his manifesto and he can't do it. If I was, I'm not even sure I'm about to say this because it's beyond my imagination, but if I was a Conservative, I'd be a little bit alarmed, I think, about what that says about the general approach and competence of the government.
Spain says that you'd go to the back of the queue in terms of rejoining the EU. The SNP has been wooing Madrid, hasn't it? And just saying that you're...
Wooing Madrid? I'm not quite sure what that would entail.
Well, you're saying that you're neutral in terms of Catalonian independence. That's a big shift.
Look, well, what I see is it's for every country to decide its own future. I don't take kindly to people in other countries trying to dictate to Scotland what we should do, and therefore I think I should probably exercise that same restraint with others. But if we woo anybody and everybody to try to make the case that Scotland is an outward-looking, internationalist, open, welcoming country that wants to make a contribution to the world, we're already back into some of these same fears and smears that we had in 2014. We've had many. I can think of one in particular, Spanish politicians this week saying that it's rubbish, that of course Spain wouldn't veto Scotland being in Europe. What we'll do before asking people to make a choice is set out the proposition that shows how with independence we can make decisions that are better for our country, whether that's our place in Europe and the world or how we build a stronger economy and build a fairer society. And then we'll give people the choice. And it is about choice. We're at an important crossroads, not just Scotland, but the UK as a whole is at an important crossroads. And whatever path we take as a country, what's most important to me is it's one we choose for ourselves, not one that we have chosen for us.